Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what pulled you into this story. If it spoke to you, drop a comment. Your words help keep history's forgotten voices alive. LaPorte, Indiana, April 1908. The farmhouse is still smoking when the neighbors arrive. Not the gentle kind of smoke that drifts upward after a kitchen fire, but the thick, choking kind that clings to the ground, that smells like wet wood, burned hair, and something else no one wants to name yet. The kind of smoke that tells you something inside didn't just burn, it ended. The fire had come fast, too fast. Flames leapt through the two-story house before anyone could stop them, swallowing the bedrooms, the walls, the past. When the roof collapsed, people assumed the story was over. They were wrong. Inside the ruins, investigators find bodies, not one, not two, more. Some burned beyond recognition, others altered, dismembered, buried shallow as if whoever placed them there never expected anyone to look too closely. And then comes the problem. The woman who owned the house, the woman whose name is on every deed, every insurance policy, every whispered rumor cannot be found. Belle Gunness is gone, her children are dead, her farmhouse is ash, her hired hand is missing, and the body believed to be hers is wrong in ways no one can ignore. Too small, too light, missing a head, newspapers explode, reporters descend. America smells a monster, but monsters don't usually plan this carefully. And before Belle Gunness becomes a headline, a legend, a warning whispered to lonely men and ambitious women alike, she was something else entirely. She was a girl who learned very early that survival in this world had less to do with kindness and everything to do with calculation. Belle Gunness, America's female Bluebeard. The woman who buried men and vanished, the farm that wouldn't stay quiet before there was Belle. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter, Sturseth, in 1859 in rural Norway, in a world that did not bend easily for women. Her childhood was cold, literally and otherwise, hard soil, long winters, families stacked on top of one another in poverty that did not apologize. You learned to endure, or you learned to disappear. There is a story, half recorded, half whispered, that follows her from those early years. They say she was pregnant as a teenager. They say a wealthy man kicked her in the stomach during a village dance. They say she lost the child. They say he was never punished. No court records confirm it, no documents preserve it. But the absence of proof does not mean the absence of consequence. Something in Brynhild calcified. Whether through that incident or 1,000 smaller humiliations, she learned a lesson women have been learning for centuries. Pain that doesn't kill you doesn't make you stronger. It makes you quieter, smarter, more patient. In her early 20s, she leaves Norway for America, part of the great wave of immigrants chasing a promise that sounded like mercy, but often delivered something else entirely. She arrives in Chicago and does the most American thing possible. She changes her name. Brynhild becomes Belle. And with that renaming comes permission, not from the world, but from herself, to become someone new. America is full of reinvention stories. But Belle's is different. Hers is not about hope. It's about control. She marries, she works, she learns how systems function, she watches what people ignore. She notices how tragedy can soften suspicion, how grief can excuse questions, how a woman who looks perpetually unlucky is rarely examined closely. Belle does not yet kill, but she is learning how death behaves. She is learning how fires are reported, how insurance claims are processed, how sympathy works like a shield, and most importantly, she is learning this. If enough terrible things happen to you, no one considers the possibility that you might be making them happen. By the time Belle Gunness becomes a wife, then a widow, then a woman with money and land, she is no longer reacting to life. She is engineering it. And America, still half asleep to the idea that a woman could be dangerous by design, never sees her coming. Marriage as a weapon. Belle Gunness did not marry for love. That alone does not make her unusual. Plenty of women in late 19th century America married for stability, for legitimacy, for survival. What makes Belle different is that she understood something most people never articulate out loud. Marriage is a contract. Death is a loophole. Her first husband was a Danish immigrant named Mads Sørensen. They married in 1884, settling in Chicago, where Belle played the role expected of her, hard-working, reserved, perpetually unlucky. The kind of woman tragedies seemed to follow like weather, and tragedy arrived right on schedule. Within a few years, 2 of their children died in infancy. Official cause, acute colitis. A common enough diagnosis at the time. Infant mortality was high, grief was ordinary. Doctors signed papers, neighbors brought casseroles, no one lingered. Then the house burned down, insurance paid out. And then Mads died. Collapsed suddenly, doctors said. A heart condition. He was 39 years old. What raised eyebrows, quietly, much later, was timing. Mads died on the very day 2 separate life insurance policies overlapped. One old, one new. Together they paid Belle a tidy sum. Enough to start again. Enough to buy land. Enough to step into the next phase of her life. At the time, no one accused her. Why would they? She was a grieving widow. A mother who had buried children. A woman struck repeatedly by bad luck. And in a culture that still believed women existed at the mercy of fate rather than as agents within it, bad luck was explanation enough. Belle learned something essential here. Death did not attract suspicion if it arrived wearing tragedy, and tragedy, if staged correctly, could be profitable. She moved on without hesitation. A new city, a new man, a new name, almost. The pattern repeats not as accident, but as rehearsal. Her second husband was Peter Gunness, a widower himself, with children of his own. They married in 1900 and settled in Indiana, where Belle purchased a large farmhouse outside La Porte. To neighbors, it looked like ambition, stability, the American dream taking root, but inside the marriage, something was wrong. Peter died less than a year later. Belle claimed a meat grinder fell from a shelf and crushed his skull, a freak accident, a tragic mishap. Authorities noted inconsistencies. A coroner briefly questioned the story. Then Belle cried. Witnesses would later recall how she wept, loudly, convincingly, collapsing into chairs, invoking God and fate and suffering. The performance worked. The investigation closed. Insurance paid out again. By now the pattern was forming. Not obvious, not crude, but visible to anyone willing to see it. 2 husbands dead, multiple children gone, fires, payouts, and Belle? Belle grew calmer with each loss. She did not spiral, she did not retreat, she expanded, she bought more land, took in boarders, advertised for companionship, built a life that revolved entirely around her control, her property, her rules, her kitchen table, where men would soon sit and believe they were choosing their future. Belle Gunness was no longer reacting to opportunity. She was designing it, and still, no one stopped her. Because in a country obsessed with the idea that women were naturally passive, naturally nurturing, naturally incapable of violence, without hysteria or madness, the possibility that Belle was deliberate simply did not compute. She was not angry, she was not erratic, she was efficient. And that, in a woman, was something America had no language for yet. By the time Belle placed her first personal advertisement in the paper, inviting lonely men with means to share her farm and her life, she was no longer improvising. She was executing a system. And the bodies were about to start accumulating faster than anyone could ignore. The Lonely Hearts Trap. By the time Belle Gunness began placing advertisements in newspapers, she had perfected her camouflage. She presented herself as a prosperous widow, hard-working, God-fearing, lonely, but not desperate. Her ads were carefully worded, practical, almost dull. Widow who owns a fine farm desires to make acquaintance of gentlemen equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No romance, no poetry, just numbers and stability. That was the bait. Men answered from all over the country, farmers, laborers, small businessmen, immigrants like herself, men with savings accounts, life insurance policies, and no one who would ask too many questions if they vanished. Men who believed they were entering a partnership, not a trap. They arrived at Belle's farm carrying suitcases. They never left with them. Neighbors noticed things at first in fragments. A man would arrive on a train and be seen walking toward Belle's property. Days later, no one would see him again. Belle always had explanations. He decided not to stay. He went west for work. He drank too much and moved on. The answers were reasonable. The Midwest was full of drifters. Men came and went all the time. And Belle, solid, domestic, maternal, did not fit the profile of danger anyone recognized. But something about the farm felt wrong. The soil around the pig pen was constantly disturbed. Freshly turned earth appeared, then disappeared. The smell was strange, metallic, sweet, lingering. Belle discouraged visitors. She dismissed hired hands quickly. One man in particular, Ray Lamphere, knew too much. He was volatile, unstable, easy to blame. Belle made sure everyone knew it. If something went wrong, Ray would be the villain. Inside the farmhouse, Belle was methodical. She cooked large meals. She served coffee. She waited until men were relaxed, trusting, grateful. And then, when opportunity aligned, she acted. Poison, blunt force, suffocation. The exact method remains unclear because Belle did not leave witnesses. She left graves. Investigators would later uncover dozens of bodies buried on her property, some wrapped, some dismembered, some scattered in ways that suggested speed rather than ritual. This was not rage, this was processing. And the most chilling part? Belle kept records. She managed correspondence carefully. She cashed checks. She transferred funds. She wrote letters to families, pretending their sons were alive and well, merely busy or traveling. She controlled the narrative even after death. Belle Gunness wasn't hiding chaos, she was running an operation. What finally cracked the illusion wasn't law enforcement, it wasn't suspicion, it wasn't conscience, it was proximity. People got too close. Ray Lamphere became unpredictable. Neighbors whispered more openly. A woman named Jenny Olson, Belle's foster daughter, grew afraid. Jenny later testified that Belle told her calmly that she planned to kill her and make it look like an accident. Jenny ran, and when she did, the machine began to wobble. Belle knew it. The farm had served its purpose. The money had been harvested. The soil was too crowded with secrets. She had always planned for this moment, always understood that control is temporary, and exits matter more than entrances, which brings us to the fire. Because Belle Gunness did not believe in being caught, she believed in endings she could write herself. And the farmhouse was about to burn. When the ground turns against you, by early 1908, Belle Gunness understood something had shifted. The farm was no longer invisible. Too many men had passed through La Porte and never written home again. Too many letters went unanswered. Too many trunks had arrived and never departed. The soil around the property, once just busy, now looked disturbed in a way that even polite neighbors could not ignore. And then there was Ray Lamphere. Ray was everything Belle usually avoided. Unstable, impulsive, loud. He drank, he argued, he threatened. He knew too much and lacked the discipline to keep quiet about it. Belle had once tolerated him because he was useful, strong, obedient, willing to do unpleasant work. But usefulness has an expiration date. When Jenny Olson fled the farm, the risk became real. Jenny didn't just leave, she told people why. She spoke about Belle's temper, her threats, her casual references to murder, spoken not in rage, but in calculation. Belle had always relied on disbelief to protect her, on the idea that no one would take a woman's threats seriously. But disbelief, once cracked, spreads fast. Sheriff Smutzer began paying attention. Neighbors talked more openly. Ray began behaving erratically, telling anyone who would listen that Belle had killed men and buried them on her land. Conveniently, Ray sounded insane. Belle encouraged that perception. She told people he was dangerous. She had him arrested briefly. She made sure everyone knew he was capable of violence. If someone needed to be blamed, Ray would do nicely. Still, Belle sensed the walls closing in. She began withdrawing money, selling possessions, quietly preparing. She purchased chloroform. She asked unusual questions about insurance. She sent her children away, some to school, some to acquaintances, creating distance between herself and the attachments that might slow her down. This wasn't panic. This was logistics. Belle Gunness had always planned for the end game. A woman who lives by systems does not trust them forever. She understood that no operation lasts indefinitely, not without exposure. And so she prepared her exit. On the night of April 27, 1908, the farmhouse exploded into flame. The fire was violent, total, the kind that leaves nothing recognizable behind. When authorities searched the ruins, they found bodies, children, unmistakably, and a woman believed to be Belle. But something was wrong. The corpse was missing its head, and the body did not match Belle's known size or weight. As investigators dug through the wreckage, they found more. Bones buried in the yard, partial remains, enough evidence to confirm what many had suspected too late. Belle Gunness had been killing men, but the most unsettling question had not yet been answered. Was Belle Gunness dead, or had she planned this too? Because if the fire was an ending, it was an ending designed by someone who had never once allowed fate to make decisions for her. And if Belle survived the fire, then America's female Bluebeard didn't vanish. She simply changed her name again. The fire, the body, and the lie that wouldn't stay, buried. The morning after the fire, Laporte gathered like a wake. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to blackened beams and the sour smell of wet ash. Investigators sifted through the wreckage expecting closure. What they found instead was confusion stacked on top of horror. The children were there, their bodies were identified quickly, too quickly. Neighbors recognized clothing, personal items. The grief was immediate, undeniable, but the woman believed to be Belle. That was where everything fell apart. The body was decapitated, burned beyond recognition. But when doctors examined the remains, they noticed something impossible. The corpse was too small. Belle Gunness had been a large woman, over 6 feet tall, well over 250 pounds. This body was significantly lighter, shorter, frailer. The bones did not align with her known size. The pelvis, the limbs, the proportions, all wrong. Someone suggested fire distortion, others suggested decomposition, but seasoned examiners knew better. Fire does not shrink bone structure that way. And then came the stomach. The autopsy revealed strychnine poisoning. Belle had insured herself heavily. Strychnine was fast, efficient, familiar to her. The conclusion became unavoidable. The woman in the fire had been poisoned before the flames ever started, which meant this was not an accident, it was a substitution. Authorities turned on Ray Lamphere immediately. He had threatened Belle publicly. He had argued with her. He had been seen near the property the night of the fire. Under pressure, frightened and erratic, Ray confessed to arson, but not to murder. And then something stranger happened. Ray recanted. From his cell, he told a different story, one that made the room go quiet. Belle, he said, had planned everything. She had told him she was leaving. She had asked for help burning the house. She had promised him money. She had already secured a body, another woman, similar enough to pass at a glance, poisoned and placed in her bed. Ray claimed Belle walked away alive. Officials dismissed him as unstable, but the evidence wouldn't cooperate. As investigators dug up the farmyard, the true scale of Belle's operation emerged. Bones surfaced, teeth, jaw fragments, partial skeletons, some hacked apart, some burned, some intact enough to estimate age and sex. At least 11 victims were confirmed. Some estimates climbed past 30, possibly more. Men who answered Lonely Hearts ads, men who trusted a widow with a farm and a warm kitchen, men who vanished without a trace because no one was looking for them. Belle Gunness had not been sloppy. She had been methodical, which is why the final question lingered like smoke that refused to clear. If Belle had planned everything, if the body wasn't hers, if the poison was intentional, if Ray was a pawn, Then the fire wasn't the end of Belle Gunness, it was her disappearance. And that means, somewhere, possibly, a woman walked away from a burning farmhouse in Indiana carrying stolen money, new papers, and a lifetime of practiced deception. Belle Gunness didn't just murder people, she murdered certainty. And in doing so, she left behind something far more disturbing than a body count. She left behind the possibility that evil doesn't always end in justice. Sometimes it just leaves. The woman who walked out of the fire. After the ashes cooled and the bodies were counted, after Ray Lamphere died in prison insisting Belle had escaped, America tried to do what it always does with unresolved horror. It tried to move on, but Belle Gunness wouldn't let it, because she kept appearing, not clearly, not conveniently, but just enough to make people uneasy. Within months of the fire, sightings surfaced across the Midwest. A tall woman traveling alone, a Scandinavian accent, a widow who avoided questions and paid in cash. In Chicago, in Iowa, in Wisconsin, some said she crossed into Canada. Others swore she boarded a ship headed for Norway, slipping back into a country that had never truly known what she became. There were letters too, unverified, anonymous, postmarked from nowhere specific. Notes that hinted, just barely, at survival, at starting over, at a woman who believed she had beaten the system designed to catch her. Police dismissed most of it as hysteria, but privately, many admitted the truth was uncomfortable. They had no proof she was dead, no head, no dental records that matched, no definitive body. And Belle Gunness was not the kind of woman who left loose ends by accident. Think about it. She knew poison, she knew insurance law, she knew how to dismember bodies, how to burn flesh, how to stage scenes that told the story she wanted told. She had rehearsed death before, twice, with husbands who conveniently died when it benefited her. If anyone in early 20th century America knew how to fake a death convincingly, it was Belle Gunness. And if she escaped, she did so into a world uniquely suited for disappearance. There were no photographs on driver's licenses, no centralized records, no fingerprints stored across jurisdictions. Women could change names with ease, widows especially, immigrants most of all. Belle had already reinvented herself once, moving from Norway to America, from Brynhild to Belle, from poverty to property. Why not again? Some historians argue she couldn't have lived long, that she was too conspicuous, too infamous, but infamy fades when it's poorly documented. And Belle's victims, mostly men without families, without advocates, without anyone demanding answers. Which brings us to the most chilling possibility of all. Belle Gunness may not have stopped killing because she was caught. She may have stopped because she finished extracting what she wanted from that chapter of her life, finished feeding the machine that required blood and trust and loneliness. The farmhouse wasn't just a crime scene, it was a closing act, a final illusion, and the woman who walked away, if she did, would have carried with her something more valuable than money: experience. Belle Gunness understood something most criminals never do. You don't defeat the law by outrunning it. You defeat it by ending the story on your own terms. And if that's true, if Belle survived, then the last thing she ever stole wasn't a fortune, it was certainty. Because even now, more than a century later, no one can say with confidence what happened to her. No grave holds her name, no record confirms her death, no ending satisfies the scale of what she did. Belle Gunness remains suspended between history and myth, a woman who may have burned alive or may have stepped into the night, free, anonymous, and utterly unrepentant. And that possibility, that she won, is the most disturbing legacy she left behind. The kind of monster we never learned how to name Belle Gunness unsettles us because she refuses every category we built to feel safe. She wasn't chaotic, she wasn't impulsive, she wasn't driven by frenzy or madness. She was methodical. She read the world around her and learned exactly which doors opened for a woman who looked like her: grief, marriage, motherhood, vulnerability. She learned how pity could be sharpened into a weapon, how loneliness could be harvested, how trust could be fattened before slaughter, and that is why history struggled to write her. Because Belle Gunness did not fit the story America preferred to tell about violence. Men kill because they are violent. Women kill because they are broken. Belle killed because it worked. That idea, cold, unromantic, deliberate, was more threatening than any pitchfork or poison. So, history softened her when it could, sensationalized her when it couldn't, turned her into a grotesque caricature, the female Bluebeard, the Black Widow, the Ogre of La Porte. Anything that made her feel unreal, but she was real. She lived in a farmhouse, she wrote letters, she cooked meals, she smiled at neighbors, she sang hymns, she murdered people who trusted her, and perhaps most disturbing of all, she did it without ever needing an audience. There were no manifestos, no confessions, no final monologue, just holes in the ground. Belle Gunness forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it arrives dressed as opportunity, as love, as a promise of a better life. And when that evil wears a woman's face, especially one that does not beg for sympathy, it terrifies societies that rely on women being legible, predictable, containable. If Belle died in that fire, then justice was clumsy but final. But if she lived, if she walked away with soot on her clothes and blood money in her pocket, then the ending is something far worse. It means the system failed completely. It means intelligence, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human weakness were enough to beat the law. It means Belle Gunness did not vanish, she evolved, and maybe that is why her story still unsettles us more than a century later. Not because she killed, but because she might have gotten away with it. What her story asks us. Every era invents the monsters it needs. Belle Gunness was ours. She reflected a world obsessed with marriage as safety, wealth as virtue, and women as harmless by default. She exposed how easily trust could be manipulated and how blind society was to danger when it arrived wrapped in domestic normalcy. Her legacy is not the body count, it's the question she leaves behind. How many warnings did people ignore because they didn't believe a woman like her could be dangerous, and how many stories like hers never made it into history because the ending was too uncomfortable to print? Belle Gunness does not offer closure. She offers a mirror, and what we see in it depends on whether we believe monsters are born or built by the systems that refuse to imagine them.
And that's where we leave her, on the page, in the archive, in the rumor, in the shadow she carved into history. Maybe she was a villain. Maybe she was a victim. Maybe she was something far more dangerous, a woman who refused the role she was handed. But one thing is certain, the world wasn't ready for her then, and it still isn't now. If you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole of power, defiance, and the women history tried to bury, make sure you're here for the next chapter, because there are more of them, more rebels, more survivors, more legends disguised as scandals. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you were told, and keep an eye on the women they warned you about.